I want to just go ahead and jump right into it, everyone. So, welcome and hello. I am David Dirks, and on behalf of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, I would like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us on this very important webinar. With all that we continue to endure this year, we all have been talking about it. Your commitment to, give me one second, your commitment to ensuring that people experiencing homelessness know that they too can vote, make their voices heard to be amended. I want to take a moment to recognize the life and legacy of both Justice Ginsburg and the late, great John Lewis. I think a lot of us are where we are because of giants like Justice Ginsburg and John Lewis. So definitely wanted to take a moment to just recognize their work before we start. Next, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. I know that many of you have already, we're what, month 6 of having to do everything over Zoom, so 6 or 7. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Zoom already, but we have enabled the chat, polling, and Q&A functions. We have 4 poll questions, and I'm gonna ask Aaron to do that for us if he remembers how to do it. All right, so we have some poll questions here that I would like for you guys to answer as I continue to do these introductions. This just very short introduction, but they should be fairly quick. So please try to do it. I see one person, so you guys are getting, there you go, gonna start coming in. If you are having issues with the webinar, please let us know in the chat box. I did see someone raise their hand. We'll try to, message you separately if you're having issues, but we are very limited in what we can help with. But if you're having issues with audio or anything, if you can't hear, just let us know and we will, try to help and troubleshoot as best as we can. And if you have a question, Quinn mentioned this earlier, if you have a question while we're speaking, we do have a Q&A at the end of the session, but if you want to ask a question or something, if there's an aha moment for you as we are talking, please feel free to address your questions in the Q&A function down below as well.
David,
I messed up. So
yeah.
The second option on the poll number 2 is no. My apologies.
It was a subtle but not so subtle way of saying you cannot not do this.
Absolutely. So, Michelle, I just got your email. Are you good now? I think it was about your screen.
So if you can all hear me,
yes,
then I think I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. All right, so you guys are taking the poll. So it looks like, we wanted to ask a few questions. Looks like most of you are 501c3s or 501c4s. Some of you don't know, which is okay. Looks like everyone has begun their voter efforts, thanks to my mistake. And also, just looking at how's your organization ever conducted voter registration. So it's across the board, mixture there. So we really wanted to get to know who was attending the session. So this is interesting information. And then, are you currently engaging with clients around voter registration? I really want to get those no's down as much as possible. And maybe that's why you're here today. I want to say at the beginning, it is not too late. It is not too late at all. So Michelle and Gwen, are you guys good with the poll? Need any more information off of here for you guys?
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay,
Michelle?
sure.
All good. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so Today is National Registration Day, National Voter Registration Day, and it's a nonpartisan campaign simply to help get people registered to vote. As I said a few seconds ago, it is not too late to register people to vote. And the Everyone Votes campaign was created with providers in mind to help people experiencing homelessness, register to vote and get out to vote. We created a campaign to provide you with resources to quickly get your efforts launched. And before we jump into those resources, I would like to introduce your speakers for today. First, you will hear from Quinn Tu, and she is from the Alliance for Justice and their Boulder Advocacy initiative. Our second speaker you will hear from is Michelle Cantor-Cohen, and she's from the Fair Elections Center. So, Quinn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you. I am going to stop your screen share and start my screen share. Okay. Just want to make sure that I'm sharing the right screen.
Absolutely.
With you. Okay, thumbs up, you can see my screen. This is usually, thank you, what I start with because I want us to be mindful of the fact that we all need to take care of ourselves as we keep doing this work. And we touched upon that a little bit in the pre-chat. So just a reminder, some days we'll feel like we can take on the world and do the 12,000 steps. And other days we're lounging on the couch and going, no steps, please. My plate is full. I can't take anymore. And all of those are valid reactions. But please do what you need to lift yourself up. So, as David has briefly introduced, my name is Quinn Tu, and I am an attorney at Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy. That is our program that directly works with nonprofit organizations on the rules around advocacy, and I'm going to be talking very briefly about voter registration and get out the votes. I will share these PowerPoint slides with you post training today, so you'll have my contact information in PowerPoint. This is a slide that tells you how to access our free technical assistance hotline that we run at Boulder Advocacy. We have 10 attorneys who take turns staffing the technical assistance hotline. You can either email us at advocacy@afj.org, or you can call us at 866 NP Lobby. We have a whole bunch of free tools, fact sheets, and publications at boulderadvocacy.org, so feel free to check that out. And we're on all your typical social media, so follow us if you would like. The disclaimer that comes with this training is that even though your majority of your interaction is going to be with attorneys at Boulder Advocacy, we do not represent anybody. We do not have clients. So we also do not provide legal advice, but we will do our best to help you navigate these complex rules and direct you to resources or other people who may be able to answer your questions as necessary. So briefly, we're going to talk about the types of nonprofits. I see that there's about 23% of you who don't know if you're working for a C3, 4, or some other type of organization. So we'll cover that and give you a basic understanding. The important takeaway, if you don't take away anything else today, is if you are a 501c3, there is a prohibition that the IRS has put into place, and that is you have to be nonpartisan. Nonpartisan means you cannot support or oppose a candidate for public office. It does not mean whether or not you're supporting a certain political party. So 501c3s cannot do anything to support or oppose a candidate for public office. Then we'll talk briefly about voter education, because you can do voter education while you're doing voter registration. We will cover voter outreach, which includes voter registration and get out the vote, which you can also do voter education on. So I'm going to fly through this pretty fast. If you have questions, drop them off in the chat, or remember that we have a technical assistance hotline and you're more than welcome to follow up with me later as well. So the types of nonprofits that we have in this world. We have the 501c3 public charity, which about 63% of you said that you work for a C3, and then 4% said you work for both a C3 and a C4. So an example of a public charity is the League of Conservation Voter Education Fund. These are tax-exempt organizations that do not have to pay income tax, and they also get to tell donors that their donations are tax deductible. Because of this sweet, favorable treatment, that's where the prohibition of not being able to support or oppose a candidate comes into play for a C3. Then we have this next category, which is a C4, 5, or 6. So C4s are your social welfare organization. The League of Conservation Voter is an example of a C4. A C5 are labor unions. So your AFL-CIO, SEIU, those are C5s. And C6s are your trade association. So most people don't think about this, but the NFL is a trade association and a type of nonprofit. They're also tax exempt, but they don't get the tax deduction that you see in the C3 column. Because of that, they are allowed to get involved in some electoral activity. They just have to follow federal and state election law, and it has to be their secondary activity. Again, if you have questions about this, feel free to reach out to us. And then to round up the types of nonprofits is the 527s, or political organization. The League of Conservation Voter Victory Fund is an example of this. And I deliberately chose these for examples because you notice that it's like a family of organization. And sometimes when you're looking at a message and you go, wait, I thought they couldn't do that, you have to be clear which organization is speaking. It may be that you're looking at a message and it came from a C4 or a 527. And those are permissible, but not for a C3 to do. So the 527s are also tax exempt, and they usually are only involved in the electoral arena where they're trying to get a person or a slate of candidates elected to office. So that's your overview of the types of nonprofits. And if you have any questions about whether you work for one or more of these organizations, our technical assistance hotline is the perfect place for that. And I'd love to have those conversations with you at a future date. So the first thing that I like to remind people is that C3s and C4s can engage in voter education, and it's not too late to do so right now, right? That means educating voters on the voting process. So this is an example for a South Carolina group that I train. You know, here's all the requirements for South Carolina's photo ID. We have deadlines of when you have to register for in-person early voting, what the laws are, and the website that directs you to where to go for more information. C3s can put out this information for your specific state. If David wasn't clear at the beginning of this training, unfortunately, this is an area that is very state law specific. So we've tried to keep it as general as possible, and you're going to have to check your state law for more details. So educate the voters in your specific state or your specific jurisdiction on how, how to engage in the voting process. And when you're doing so, it's best practices to have a disclaimer that's very simple, that just says something like the League of Women Voters, substitute in your organization there, does not support or oppose candidates or political party. That keeps you nonpartisan. Again, nonpartisan is not the lay person's understanding. It's whether or not your C3 is doing something to support or oppose a candidate for office. So the second thing we're going to cover is the voter registration and get out the votes. And this is where C3s can absolutely engage in this. So voter registration rules, you can have this table set up pre-COVID, post-COVID. You might have to sit 6 feet or more apart, or find some other ways to do voter registration on Zoom or be creative. But you could have materials. Just be sure that there are no references to a party or a candidate. So this sign here that says register to vote here is fine until you see that little sticker with the elephant on it. If you are a C3 organization, you cannot put up this sign. A C4, 5, or 6 could, but a C3 could not. So be aware of that. Don't have any suggestions on who to vote for either. That's not C3 safe. Make the service available to everyone. You know, regardless of who it is that comes up to the table, they should be allowed to vote. And we'll come back to this last point about targeting for nonpartisan reason in a little bit. But I also want to add that if you're running a voter registration drive, do not offer incentives like free food, or you have a chance to win a raffle prize in your voter registration. That is not allowed for anybody to do, whether you're a C3, 4, 5, 6, or above. There is a prohibition about offering incentives to people to register to vote. So there
Gwen, I have
are,
a question. Sorry.
yes,
I have a
I'm
question.
just flying through this because I figure that we needed to cover material, but
Oh,
sure.
absolutely no. Particularly around some of the people attending here may already be operating sort of feeding ministries, or as a part of their services. So as far as the slide that you just showed, that's about incentivizing people to register to vote, not
Yes,
necessarily people who are already engaging, and that's a part of their regular business to provide food to the homeless, per se, correct?
absolutely. And that's a really good point to clarify. It is about offering incentives, right? So you could have things, they normally run a food shelter or a food bank or offer food. You know, it's just, you can't say, if you fill out this voter registration, we will give you some food, or you will be entered into a lottery. That is what's being disincentivized here, if I can use that word. Yes, so thank you for clarifying that.
Absolutely.
Some reasons where you can, as a C3, prioritize voter engagement, and I keep saying C3 because they have the most limitation and the most restriction, right? These restrictions don't apply to C4s, 5s, or 6s, so that's why my focus. So if your natural constituencies, you can target your voter registration drive efforts to. So these include the people who live in the region that your nonprofit operates, or the people that your nonprofit serves, or the people your organization hopes to serve. And then you could also prioritize or target historically underrepresented people at the polls. So that could be Black voters, that could be young voters. For this group, that's homeless voters, right? You can target them specifically for your voter registration drive. I saw a hand raised up. Are we going to pause for questions or take questions at the end?
Well, let's take questions at the end. But Denise, I saw that too. I was going to
Okay.
chat you separately to see if you had a question. Or
Okay. So keep your questions coming and we'll make sure that we answer them. If we don't get to them, we will follow up with you. But thank you for being engaged and interested in this material. The other thing that I want to talk about in this aspect of voter registration is what funding are you using? Federal funding, as we all know, have varying rules around voter registration. And I had asked David to ask in pre-registration how many of you get community service block grants, and we looked at it last week and it was about 66% of you or something like that. So it's important that we cover this. So if you get community development block grants, there are no restrictions. So good news, yay, do what you need to do, just stay nonpartisan. If you get community service block grants or Head Start funds, you cannot use these grants to fund staff or provide materials to conduct voter registration drives or provide rides to the polls. So the best practice here is if you could use funds that don't restrict voter registration whenever possible to do your voter registration drive. It's a little bit more complicated than that. If you fall into this category and have questions, I invite you to reach out to Boulder Advocacy's technical assistance hotline and we can walk through your individual situation so that you know that you're complying with all the funding requirements that are necessary to stay on the right side of the law. Okay. Voter registration is not the only thing that you're doing. You're also involved in planning or are doing get out the vote campaigns. You can certainly do get out the vote campaigns. They have very similar rules to voter registration, where you're supposed to encourage all eligible voters to vote, cannot bias or favor a party or a candidate if you're a C3, and don't coordinate with any party or candidate if you're a C3 as well, because that will seem like you're trying to get that side to win an election. You could also target your campaign for GOTV for the same nonpartisan reasons that we just covered. So here's some examples of GOTV ads. If your C3 runs this ad, or even if your C4 ran this ad that says show up to vote, it's pretty green light, as we'd like to say. There isn't anything here that puts it in a risky category of favoring one side or another. You're just telling people exercise your democratic rights and go vote. If you're gonna say in your Get Out the Vote campaign, vote for the environment, or hey, you know, you should vote and vote for the environment, that's more of a yellow light issue. There's some caution to be had there, and it revolves around the facts and circumstances of the case. If there is a candidate in that race that you're talking about that has made this a wedge issue for them, if this is a very decisive issue in the race, it may signal support or opposition to a candidate. So we would be happy to walk you through those factors. If your message has something like vote pro-choice, that is a red light. The IRS has said that there are certain words that have just been so politicized in the context of a vote that if you say vote pro-choice or vote pro-life, it is code for one party or another. So you can't, in a Get Out the Vote campaign, use this to encourage people to go out and vote. And then I will wrap up by saying that we at Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy are a resource for you. I have shared a link to all our elections related materials for both C3, C4s and 5s and 6s for you to check out. And some of the main resource that we have are rules of the game. And we also have a podcast that we launch in August. And one of our first episodes talks about advocacy in an election year. So check that out. It's called Rules of the Game, and it's on all of the major podcast platform, but also on our website at boulderadvocacy.org/podcasts. And then super quickly on boulderadvocacy.org, we also have advocacy capacity tools and community organizing capacity tools that if you're interested in, they are free for you to use. Look up ACT or Power Check, and you'll have more tools and resources to work with. And that is the end of my presentation.
Awesome. We are going to, I hope you guys can hear me. I think I unmuted myself. Yes. Awesome. Michelle, you can take it over.
Great. Okay, I'm just going to take a minute to take over the screen sharing.
There you go.
All right, everybody see?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So thank you for having me. My name is Michelle Cantor-Cohen. I'm Senior Counsel at Fair Elections Center. And I'm here to talk about voter registration and some of the details that you will want to think about when getting a voter registration program up and running for your clients. Fair Elections Center is a 501c3. And as Quinn said, I am here to give guidance and not legal advice. I do not represent you. If you feel that you need an attorney to figure out some of these things, it's important to connect with somebody in your state who is barred in the state to give legal advice. We're here to talk about getting your clients, your constituents registered to vote. And just really quickly, we'll talk a little bit, just overview of voter registration and go through voter registration rules, some special considerations for voters experiencing homelessness, and some best practices for voter registration drives. Also point to a few resources that we have at the end. So quick overview. So as those of you, of course, who have been working on voter registration know, you can't vote if you're not registered. So that's why voter registration is so important. And there is no national registration system. You know, there's a lot of national media. So people often might assume that it works the same way in every state. And there are certainly some federal laws, some things that are the same. But for the most part, the rules are based on where you live. And there are different rules about voter registration and voter registration drives in every state. In some states, you can register on election day, up to and on election day. But in most states, you have to register ahead of time to vote in the election. In many states, the last day to register is 30 days before the election. That's coming up quickly. So yes, there's time, but it's time to focus in and hurry up and use this national voter registration day to get something going as soon as we all can. In terms of the nuts and bolts, there are a couple of different ways logistically to register to vote. There are state voter registration forms in every state. There's also a federal voter registration form that's accepted in 47 states. There's also online registration available in most states, but I will note that in most states, in order to complete the full process online, you have to have a DMV issued ID or driver's license. So that can certainly be limiting because, of course, not everybody has a state ID or driver's license. The registration process itself involves filling out the form, turning it into the election official. Information collected on forms is typically the full legal name, address, an ID number that can be either a driver's license or state ID number if you have one, or the last 4 digits of the social. There are a few states that require the full social security number if the person has been assigned one. Birth date and signature. So I mentioned the federal form. It's a form that can be used by people who live all over the country, accepted in 47 states. And as particularly relevant here, it contains a map for people without traditional addresses to show where they live. And I'll show, I think later on in the presentation, I have like a zoomed in view of that section of the form. But just broadly speaking, the federal form has a section that has state instructions for each state. So there are different variations, for example, of what you need to put down for your ID number, things like that, depending on the state. So let's talk about voter registration drives. Helping people register to vote it can happen in different ways. Usually when I think about a registration drive, I think about, you know, when you collect registration applications from people who are registering and hand them in to election officials for them. That's effective because it makes sure that, you know, you can help them fill out the form and then get them registered, because the form is, you know, you're guaranteeing that the form gets there. A lot of times, you know, you can give out a form and that is helpful, especially where people don't have any other access to a form, and putting that in their hands is certainly helpful. But the most effective thing to do is to, you know, help them follow through the process. You know, you can also encourage registration by appointing clients to civic engagement resources. You know, as mentioned before, there's a wide variation in state laws that includes voter registration drive rules. Some states have few or no restrictions. There are some that have modest sets of rules, and then there are states like Texas, Florida, and a few others that have really elaborate sets of rules and restrictions in order to conduct a voter registration drive. Some examples of restrictions that you will want to know about in your state are whether the drive has to, or the person organizing it has to register with the state or locality, or even in some cases, the individual person collecting a form. Texas is a place like that. There are rules about training in some states, like what kind of training has to be obtained and by whom, which forms can be used, some rules about how you can pay people collecting forms. Broadly speaking, many states have a restriction, and we also recommend as a best practice that you do not pay people based on the number of forms that they collect. You know, paying people, if you're just paying people to do a registration drive based on an hourly or something like that, is generally fine. And then, you know, in the context when you are already doing voter registration, you just want to make sure that you're not creating incentives for staff that are based on the number of forms. And then the deadline to turn in forms is often different than the voter registration deadline overall. So some states say that you have to turn them in within, say, 10 days. There's a couple of states with 5-day deadline. New Mexico is 48 hours. There's a wide range. And then there are a few states where the deadline is what we would refer to as the book closing, which is the voter registration deadline. And you always want to have your forms in by then. Otherwise, you know, voters who help register won't actually get to vote. Just real quickly, we have a Fair Election Center has guides, say 49 states, since there's one state without a voter registration process, 30 third-party registration drive guides that are up on our website, and hopefully will be helpful to you, I think, in you know, pointing you to what types of things you need to look into and think about in your state. I wanted to talk about some special considerations for voters experiencing homelessness. So addresses is obviously a big concern in thinking about how someone fills out the voter registration form. The form generally has a space for the residential address as well as a mailing address. In terms of the residence, and again, this is something that is going to vary by state in terms of how they're asking you to, or how they're asking the voter to indicate where they live. But you know, voters experiencing homelessness, citizens experiencing homelessness have a right to register to vote, you know, no matter where they live. So in some places you indicate that by providing a shelter that the person regularly goes to. Some of the state forms also have maps, so providing a location of a place where a person stays most regularly on a map, for example, like a park where they usually sleep. And you can indicate where that is on a map if there's no street address. Some states' voter registration forms, as I mentioned, also include the map similar to the federal form. However, go off that quite yet. People do need to indicate a mailing address if at all possible, because mailing addresses are necessary for receiving information and ensuring that people stay registered. Perhaps they could use a shelter where they can get mail. If it's at your organization where you're helping them get their mail, they could use that address for mailing. In some places, jurisdictions will use the election office itself, but you should check with the local election official as to what they recommend for the mailing address. Okay, and here is the example at the federal form where they have, you can see the map showing the cross streets here, and just an opportunity to show landmarks and things like that to demonstrate where the person lives. So another potential concern that you might get questions about is around mental capacity and mental competence, because it's often something related to that is often in the list of qualifications to register to vote. And again, I'm speaking broadly because this does vary by state. The formulation in most places is that the person is disenfranchised while they're under a court order that's determined that they're not competent to vote. And that specifically that relates to voting rights. So, people are not generally automatically disenfranchised just because, say, they have a guardianship related to their finances, or, they have a mental illness diagnosis. So it's generally more specific and related to competency specifically for voting. But people should check with local election officials if that rule or standard is not clear. One place to look is on the official state voter registration form, or the state instructions on the federal form that talk about that element of voters qualification. Okay, so some specific voter registration drive rules and concerns during this COVID-19 pandemic. People are thinking about how they can help remotely, and either by phone or I don't know if anybody is providing services by Zoom. I don't really know how that would work, but how that works for you and your organization. And some of those may have implications for voter registration drives. So you want to look for rules requiring assistance to be provided in the applicant's presence. For example, Minnesota has a rule like that. The Secretary of State has indicated. And then some states have rules about whether you can send an applicant a pre-filled form. That would be if you are, you have their information already and you want to send them a form. In some states, if you can't do that without their permission. I should say you can't sign it for them really in any circumstance, unless they're unable to sign and they're giving you permission and you fill out what you need to fill out. But generally speaking, you can't send somebody a signed form or turn it in for them without their permission. That would be a problem. But in some places you can, in many places you can send somebody a form that has, for example, their name and their address, and then they have to complete the form and then sign it. But that is prohibited in a couple of places. As a best practice, it's a really good idea to review proposed process with election officials, your local election officials, and then if you can, document your meeting or your review, for example, with a follow-up letter. Thank you for meeting with me about my program. Here's what we're going to do, and then just kind of lay it out what you talked about. So Quinn already covered this. I think it probably makes sense to just say it again because it's super important. Don't offer freebies or raffle tickets just for people who register to vote. If you want to, give out something, then give it to everybody, regardless of whether they register to vote or not. So in terms of best practices, I already mentioned meeting with election officials. Election officials also may be able to help by coming to your organization and directly registering your clients. And that can be really helpful because then you're not, if they can do that, they're not waiting for a form to come. They're just like getting that form right away. You can partner with local civic engagement groups that already have done registration work if that's not something that you've done before. I think particularly on this timeline where we're looking down the registration deadlines in a couple weeks in some places, if you can get in touch with someone who's already doing that work and connect with them, that would probably be a really good way to get going quickly. And then, as mentioned before, collecting forms is certainly the best way to make sure that they are delivered. Make sure people are trained on doing voter registration. Forms and paper forms should always be written in legible handwriting so that election officials can correctly enter the information in their systems. And then where you're reviewing and taking the form, make sure to review that form for completion with the applicant, fix errors in front of them. You don't want to be correcting things once they've left your office or your table. One common error is missing the check boxes on citizenship and age. They tend to be way up at the top of the form, and people tend to miss them. And then you want to make sure that you have a secure place to keep applications before you turn them in. You also, as mentioned before, got to make sure to turn them in on time and keep track with them. Ideally, know how many forms you turned in, for example, on any given day. So here are a couple of links to our guides. Both our voting guide that has information that you can use to educate your clients in a nonpartisan way, and our voter registration drive guides, which are aimed at highlighting these differences between state law when it comes to conducting voter registration work. And you can feel free to contact me with questions, issues, and barriers to voter registration or voting. And thanks very much for having me here.
Thank you, Michelle. Everyone, you guys are asking some really good questions, and I'm going to make sure that we try to answer them. I say try because, again, we are going to definitely focus on giving general guidance as much as possible. I think you guys have heard numerous times the best guidance is to really allow to really reach out to your state to see what the rules are. It's best for you to get a lot of your specifics from your local election office. And I'm going to share a link with you all in just a second about that. Actually, let me just go into it so we can get to the Q&A. And I'm going to skip a couple of slides that we already discussed here, but go back one step really quickly. Okay, nope. So we talked about a lot of information. I want to thank Michelle and Quinn once more because they really broke down some very convoluted information and made it simple for you all. And both of them touched on some things that I was going to say as well. But the Everyone Votes campaign, if you visit our website, we have a lot of links to a lot of the resources that they both discussed. I think that it will prove to be helpful. But sort of if you're in the position to where you are just starting your efforts, develop a plan, and you want to appoint a point person to do the research and contact your local election office. The good thing about this is I've recently volunteered here in Washington, D.C. With Pathways DC, and they have a campaign called Pathways to Vote. And one person at the organization, it was a committee of people. They had their racial justice and advocacy teams decided that they wanted to really do this work in response to George Floyd's death. And everything that was going on in the country right now. So they contacted the local election office, got forms, they have a contact there. So, you know, don't ignore this step. This step is very important. And the link here on this on this page is on our web page. It is in our toolkit. This link will allow you to easily access the information that you need to figure out who is the election official, or what is the number, what's the fax number, what's the email address in your county, in your township, or in your parish, in the sense of if anyone's joining us from Louisiana. But they already talked about it, eligibility issues, address requirements. Let me be clear. It is pretty much settled law across this country that you do not have to have a traditional dwelling. So I want to be clear because you guys are, you know, this population means so much to me. So and that's why it's important to contact your local election office to see, instead of you trying to figure out, to ask them directly. If I'm registering people who are homeless, how can I determine what their address is going to be? For those of you who are operating day centers or shelters, you should, you know, make a policy for this election cycle and after to collect mail on behalf of your clients and use that address. You want to know what the process is for online and paper form registration. Michelle talked about that. And the biggie here, and Michelle mentioned this as well, a few of the states, and I have a slide that I'm going to rush through in a few seconds, but a few of you are in states whose registration deadlines, no matter if it's a mail-in registration, if it's an online registration, if they offer it, or if it's in-person registration, they're coming up. So there's usually 3 ways to try to register in some states. So reaching out to partner organizations that's already doing this work in your state, in your area, could be prove to be very helpful to get your clients registered. I also want to express here as well is that, you know, this is not a quantity race. This is a quality race. If you're going to provide this service to individuals, then you want to make sure that you're giving the best information that you possibly could know, and that you do it in a nonpartisan way, that you do it equally to all your clients. But hey, if you can get 4 people registered, I say it's a success. If you can get 20 people registered, a success. So, you know, be gracious with yourself. You know, it's a lot to do in a little bit of time. So really quickly, the following states have deadlines the first week of October. And this list, again, as Michelle and Quinn stated, you know, is general guidance, so don't take my word for it, but I did the research myself and I checked the deadlines for this date. And this doesn't mean that with these states that it's, you know, you can register between the 4th and the 10th. It means for some of these states that the registration deadline is probably on the 4th, or it's on the 5th, or it's on the 6th, or it's on the 7th, or the 10th. So this is just a quick scan of the states that have registration deadlines coming up. Louisiana has a but-and situation. Their online registration is due on 10/13. The following states have deadlines the 2nd week of October and the 3rd week of October. Okay, you see Kansas, Nebraska, New Jersey, Oregon, Virginia, West Virginia. I'm not gonna call them out, but you just wanna pay attention to your state deadlines so that you can quickly ramp up your efforts. Okay, so these last 2 columns are, well, there's kind of 3 columns, sorry. But these last 2 options here are pretty much registration deadlines the last week of October, and the state also offers same-day registration and voting. It's Colorado, Montana, Washington, Connecticut, Vermont. The states on the right side of the screen all offer same-day registration and voting. Now, what you may find online is that these states may also have mail-in registration deadlines in the 1st, the 2nd, 3rd week of October, but that's not the end-all be-all. You still are able to register to vote on either during early voting time periods or during November 3rd on election day. But you want to be clear to know what those rules are, especially if you're sending clients out. You want to know what documents they need, because some people may have to, cast a provisional ballot. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but if anyone's having issues at the polling site, always tell your clients to request a provisional ballot. If there is an issue with their voter registration status or whatever the case may be, please tell your client to ask for a provisional ballot. It should be available in most states, but you don't want all of this effort to go by and them not be able to at least vote for in this election. So I wanted to share that with you all. Step 2, voter registration. Michelle went into pretty much good detail about this, so I'm not going to bore you all with this, but I wanted to stress 2 things after my experience registering people here in DC. Know what the felony voting rights are in your area. You would be surprised how many people don't know this information, and it's okay. Ask your local election office. Contact your legal aid office or partnership that you have, but know the rules for if people with felony records can vote and under what circumstances, because you don't want people to think that they can't vote if they've handled all of their issues, or if they did their time, they paid their fines. Recently, in Florida, I saw an article today that Michael Bloomberg paid almost the fines for 32,000 people in Florida to vote. So there may be restrictions, but you should know what that is, especially if you're facing clients that have have records. Know where the polling locations are. We were, if anyone's familiar with DC, we were in downtown DC, and we were able to tell people that their polling location was going to be at the MLK library in downtown DC. And then also ID requirements. I want you all to know that our toolkit has a lot of resources and links in here for you to get help to get people the information that they need in order to get an ID if they need one, birth certificate help. There's an organization called Vote Riders where they can pay and provide services for people to get those resources. The next step, and I promise, one more slide here. Vote. Vote like your life depends on it. No. Encourage your clients to vote. One thing, and I saw a person ask a question about this. Another thing that happened when I was registering people to vote is that they said that they weren't excited about either presidential candidates. Okay, I get it. I'm not judging. It's not my business. I'm not selling people on a candidate. I'm selling people on their right to vote. That's what I want people to exercise their right to vote. So figure out what's important to your clients, what's important to your organization. You can absolutely make a one-sheet paper that lists policies as it relates to housing or homelessness in your area, and how people are, what their policies may do or not do as it relates to that issue. That's okay to do. So you can inform people how certain individuals or candidates are going to vote on particular legislation or housing issues that are important to your organization and to your clients. You can do that. So engage with your clients. This slide is pretty much self-explanatory. Obviously, let clients know that lines may be long. The most important thing is the lines may be long. A lot of you may have saw what happened in Virginia last week or Monday, where you had people who were blocking the entrance of early voting. Things that might happen. Prepare your clients, talk to your friends, talk to your family, but program a few of the election protection hotlines numbers in your phone, and know that information in case people are having issues or they're not able to exercise their right to vote for whatever reason when they go out to vote. Okay, and also a shameless plug as well. So some of our resource, I talked about the toolkit. And then we also have many different one-sheet pagers that focus on sort of developing a plan with your staff and volunteers and reducing your staff's workload. I don't want to end this call without saying once again that I understand the stress, the amount of work that you guys are doing and have been doing for years, and especially due to COVID. So we have come up with some strategies or some guidelines that can help, not make this such an onerous task, but it's important to figure out, draw a quick list of the things that you need. And we've identified those things. ID requirements, once again, and address requirements and felony, the rights for people with felonies. So just make sure that, you invest a little bit of time up front and then you can start your efforts. So I don't want to talk anymore. I want to open this up for question and answer. And I see that the chat box was going crazy. There are 11 comments here. And again, if some of your questions are specific, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay. If some of your questions are specific, I took notes. Sorry. I'm talking and now I want to go right into Q&A. I got excited there, you guys, in case you didn't notice. Again, we can't provide legal advice, you all. And you shouldn't try to provide legal advice either, unless you are an attorney and you are hired to provide legal advice. So that's my caveat there. All of us are attorneys on this panel, and I try my best not to speak in specifics, but one question that came up, Michelle and Quinn, was the differentiation between making comments about a candidate who is the current president versus just candidates. So can you guys talk about that distinction and what you can and can't do?
Yeah, as you can imagine, I've gotten this question a lot for the past year, and I keep getting this question in the work that we do. And thank you for raising this question. I can go into a whole hour training about the nuances of this, but the short answer is that because 501c3s cannot support or oppose candidates for office, that means this current president who is running for re-election as well. So if you are going to be critiquing something that the administration has done, talk about the administration. Talk about the various agencies that are taking action on the matter, because those are not positions or people who are on the ballot. And there was a question in the Q&A box that I saw along this lines of, if we regularly mention this administration's policy, do we still have to be careful? And the answer is not to the same extent as if you're a brand new organization and have never weighed in on this issue before. So I mentioned that the facts and circumstances really make a difference here. And your history of advocacy, your organization's mission are two factors that come into play. So if you have advocated for it and you've been critical of the administration's policies on homelessness all along, you can continue to do it up to the election. We say, don't lift your foot off of the gas pedal now, because people are paying attention and they need to hear your position. But at the same time, don't accelerate it and bombard people with messages against the administration, because it will seem like you're opposing them, right? As I mentioned, our first podcast talks about these factors and how you can safely engage in advocacy during an election year. So I highly recommend it. We go into more details about the major factors that the IRS would consider. And we're always happy to talk to you about it too. We get calls about this. So we're a little bit more practiced at what could or could not be seen as risky, and we can share that information with you. You're on mute.
There was another question. You guys feel free to ask these questions in the Q&A section, but I believe this was for you, Michelle. What are the 3 states that don't use the federal registration form?
I see that
So-
Aaron answered them too,
Oh, okay.
but Michelle, you might want to pop in there.
So Wyoming, New Hampshire, and I'm at the moment
North Dakota?
right, because they don't they don't have
They
a
don't do
registration system at all. Yeah.
Yeah.
Aaron got an A+.
Well, thank you, Aaron. There was another question. I think it kind of piggybacks off of the first one, Quinn, but it's you might be able to see it as well as William Higgins. He asked a question. It's pretty long, but apparently there is a referendum on their ballot coming up in this election. So can you?
Sure. So thank you for bringing that up. That is another topic that we spent an hour on, and that involves lobbying. So for the states who have ballot measure work in the eyes of the IRS are considered to be lobbying activities. So a C3 can take a position on a ballot measure supporting or opposing it, and you can also tell people how they should vote on that ballot measure. That does not fall under electioneering work because you're not supporting or opposing a particular candidate, but you're talking about a particular proposed ballot measure that would or would not pass as law. So if you are engaged in that work, be aware that the IRS considers it lobbying, so track and report that. And then there are state laws that will impact whether or not you have to register as a committee. So for example, in California, there are requirements. If you meet thresholds that trigger reporting requirements, you will have to do that. Another caveat is if there is a person who is running for office and has tied their policy or their candidacy to that ballot measure, you want to be very careful that you're not doing work or creating content in a way that implies that you're supporting that candidate. So again, I invite you to reach out and we can have a deeper conversation about this, but I appreciate that you brought that up.
Absolutely. No, thank you. I know that we were answering a few questions in here, so I don't want to be redundant.
No, I think some of these are really good to hear verbal out loud as well.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to, Michelle, you just answered one. That actually was a one that I wanted us to answer out loud as well for everyone else that's still on the webinar. But can you just explain sort of for those, because we know people who are homeless may be very transient. So with that, with knowing that sort of what should people follow? You're muted.
The question was about whether clients coming from other communities need to re-register. And so anyone who has moved to a new address, including, just a new home base or non-traditional address, should update their registration. Different states are going to have different rules about what happens if you didn't do that and you get to the polls. But it's way better to do it now and then have an updated registration record before the deadline. And then we can talk about, GOTV and later, what do you, after the deadline, it's sort of a different message, like what can you do? Where do you vote if you didn't update? But at this point now, before all the deadlines, update the registration is the way to go.
Absolutely. Are there any other questions from any of the participants? I don't mind actually unmuting you at all either. So if anyone has a hand raised or if you have questions, I All right, there we go.
And while people are thinking about your question, I do want to share that David shared the deadline for voter registration, right? It prompted me that I saw an early voting date deadline list as well. So it came from the Declaration for American Democracy, and I have forwarded that to David to include in follow-up resources for you after this training. So you'll be able to see what the in-person voting start dates are for the respective states.
Absolutely. Thank you, Quinn. And just an FYI to all of you, just add me to your list of annoying emails until election day.
Useful
So,
emails.
useful emails until election day. But, you know, whatever information I see is helpful, I'll be passing on to you. But Kristen Langworthy, I'm going to allow you to talk right now. So unmute yourself.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Very useful information across the board. I just wanted to follow up on something that I may have missed. The map that was shown for folks who are experiencing homelessness to be able to indicate and register without having a permanent address. Is that something that is specific to each state? And is there a location that we can look for those maps to download and provide to, say, service providers or shelter providers who are working with clients that want to assist them in registering to vote?
So that map came from the federal voter registration form. There are some states that have maps on their forms as well. But I want to lift up a point that was in the chat, that you can also put the address of a park, or it doesn't need to be on a map. It's a useful option where that's the best way to demonstrate where someone stays, but that's not a requirement by any means.
All right. Yeah. And I would just add that information, from what I've read and based on the information in our toolkit, that information is usually used for assigning a precinct location. So a location where that person will go and vote. And, just in thinking about it sort of from a logistics standpoint, you want to make sure that we didn't really talk about it, but you have voting locations that are not going to be open because of COVID, or some states have closed more. So you want to make sure that a person is assigned to the right polling location, especially if you're giving that information out. As I said earlier, we knew the organization Pathways DC knew where the polling locations were, where they were signing people up at, but you want to make sure that you put the right address so that when they show up, that they're at the right polling location. Again, in most states, if you show up and you're not at the right polling location, then they may let you cast a provisional vote if you don't want to go to your actual polling location. But you got to be careful. In California, I think that's different. In LA County, I think people can vote wherever. That's what I read today. But you want to be specific as far as and just follow the rules that the election office tell you about sort of how to put the address on and what's most useful to them. Again, because you don't want to make that process harder for them as either to process the voter registration form. So that's my little addition to it. Hope I didn't give out any wrong information.
No, I think the key point is to always check with the local election official, and there's always some kind of public interface where they're happy to answer these questions because they are in charge of administering the election. And speaking as a longtime poll worker myself, we're always very interested in getting things right so that we allow people to vote. So the nice thing about having this conversation now is that you have enough time to do those follow-ups and be able to give people the correct information on what is required in your specific locale. As I talk more and more about this, I really wish that we had one national set of rules, but we don't. So we have to work with what we have at this point.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The federal form is about as close as you get for that. And that's a lot of state by state instructions.
Yeah. I mean, there was a question in the chat about what is voting eligibility. And I thought about it. I thought, I think I know what the answer is, but I would want to check with state law.
And that's such the lawyer response, but but it's true, right? I mean, in the United States, though, mostly, you know, if you're 18 years of older, or caveat, if you are younger than 18, but you will turn 18 by the time of the election, you can register to vote. And that's why a lot of places have gotten people at 16 and 17 years old, and they've been registering high school students for a long time. So there's an age requirement, and then there's those other requirements. And that's pretty much, you know, it's what the state says. And again, you know, it talks about incapacity, you know, to vote, mental incapacity, you know, if you were, Michelle talked about it earlier. And then also, you know, a resident. Some places actually say you have to be a resident for 30 days. Some places don't necessarily say that. So, you know, it really depends on the local law. But again, to piggyback on the question, Quinn, someone asked, can you quickly recap steps to take for homeless voters? And I think it was off the steps that I created. And I thought hard and long about this. If you're just starting this work, again, it's not too late. The first thing that you want to do today or tomorrow, if you're on the West Coast, you still have time. Contact your local election office. So wherever you're going to be doing your registration efforts, contact your local election office. If you have, you know, if your board or your president, your staff is on board to do this work for the next however many weeks until the registration deadlines, then contact your local election office and figure out what you can do as far as voting. You know, can you pick up registration forms? Can you vote your clients? Can they send someone to help you register your clients to vote? Contact a partner organization that's already doing registration in your area. You guys are very resourceful. You know who's in your area. So contact another partner organization to see if they can help you with your efforts. The second point is voting. So figure out what you need to vote. Some states require, as Michelle talked about, the online voting registration form. If your state, see what your state says about it, what your election office says. You know, if you're having site visits with clients and you are applying for apartments or for housing online, perhaps you can help them with their, you know, consent through Zoom, register online if they can see the form and what you're putting in on the actual computer. But you should ask your local election office what you can do and how you can do it. The easiest thing is probably getting paper forms, you know, putting a table out or giving them to your clients, helping them fill them out. If you help them, you might have to sign an attestation form to say that you helped them. If you did, and then someone from your office or your organization can drop the forms off. So that's vote. That's the register, and then do your research, develop the plan, and then actually get people registered to vote. And the last step was actually get out the vote. And we will have more resources on that in the coming weeks because we obviously have a little bit more time to talk about those efforts. That was for Anna Duggins. I hope I answered your question. You can also email me. My information is on our website. I'm happy to talk to any of you about any of the resources that you guys saw. I have, you know, Michelle and Quinn's email on speed dial at this point. They have been very helpful and useful to me, and I'm very grateful to them. But do we have any more questions from people?
This is Aaron. There was a question earlier on in the chat about restrictions on 501c3s and whether those affect the individual working for a 501c3.
Thank you, Aaron. I did see that, and thank you for bringing that up. So again, in the longer presentation, you got a snippet of what would be at least an hour-long presentation on this topic. 501c3 rules that we talked about only apply to you acting in as a representative of 501c3s. So if you're a volunteer, a board member, a staff of a C3, and you're acting for the C3, then you have to be nonpartisan. If you are acting in your own individual capacity, on your own free time, First Amendment right protects you. So you could say whatever you want to say, support whoever you want to support, and there are no limitations on that. So we say a couple of things. Be clear when you're talking to people what hat you have on. And this may be more for the leaders of a C3, like an executive director or a public-facing person who the community identifies closely with a nonprofit. You really want to say, hi, my name is Quinn Tu, and I'm here in my own individual capacity. Or, hi, my name is Quinn Tu, and I'm here representing Alliance for Justice. Because Alliance for Justice is also a C3, these rules that I talk about every day, we also have to follow. But as an individual, you don't have that. So don't use your organization's resource to do your individual partisan work. So if you get an email that says, hey, support this person's campaign by making a donation, don't forward it on your work email. Do it in your personal email. You know, it's okay if you're listed somewhere as a list of supporter and your workplace is identified, but make sure that it's for identification purposes only, and it's not that the organization is supporting whatever cause it is that you're supporting. So on social media, make sure that if you're tweeting from your personal social media account or Facebook or any other of the social media platforms that you're on, it's best to have a disclaimer that says my views are my own and they don't represent my employer. Government lawyers do it all the time. As you saw, we lawyers do it all the time when we tell you that we're not giving you legal advice. It's that disclaimer to make sure that people understand what capacity you're representing at that very time.
Absolutely. And I'll say too, because I worked for the National Alliance to End Homelessness, but I volunteered with Pathways DC. So as for volunteers, you know, just watch them, you know, and if they're doing anything wrong, you know, try to correct them and, you know, just let them know that they can't do that, you know, if they are going to be at our sanctioned event. My mentality for the time that I spent registering our homeless neighbors here in DC was, you know, I didn't get into conversations about Trump or Biden. You know, I didn't. You know, I said, you know, I understand what you're saying. Can't argue with that. Just want to make sure you know that you can vote if you want to vote, and I'm here to help you register to vote. So I was very specific for those of you thinking of how you can sort of divide sort of your registration efforts from, you know, commenting on policies or things that are going to help or hurt people who are homeless. You know, assign your staff, and I mean volunteers as well, assign your staff to the proper roles and positions and just make sure they know what they're doing. Again, I just went with the idea that I wanted to get some people registered to vote. You know, that was my passion, and it is my passion. So to that extent, let it focus on that and just watch your people. You don't want to do things in a vacuum. You want to be able to have an eye on what people are saying and how they're approaching the clients as well. So for the most part, a great experience, some great resources there, but you definitely want to be careful because this is a heightened environment. It's not a normal environment. So for a lot of different reasons, not just because of the political stuff. It's a lot going on.
And because of that, I do want to echo David's point earlier about how some people feel very turned off because of how political the environment has gotten and all of the mudslinging that's going around. It's best to tell people, vote because you care about policy. Vote because these policies will affect your life in one way or another. Not vote because you want a particular party to win or you favor a particular side.
So Kristen raised her hand again, and then it looks like Julie Winkelstein, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, had a question. These are going to be our last two questions so we can wrap up. But Julie asked, have any of us worked with libraries? So she's interested in providing a template for libraries and how they can help their local communities. I haven't. I know that, again, as I said earlier, for NDC, the day center where we were registering people at, the library is actually still closed, but they're going to open for the election, I believe. So yeah, that's about the extent I have with working with libraries, but it sounds like what you're doing is amazing. Quinn or Michelle, do you guys have any guidance or anything about that? It looks like Kristen is replying. So she's working with libraries in Rhode Island. That's why I love you guys. Yes, share information with each other. So Julie, Kristen just shared in the chat that she is working with libraries in Rhode Island. But it looks like, I don't know, Quinn or Michelle, were you guys gonna add anything to that?
Some libraries are designated as voter registration agencies, but that depends on the state. And to the point about the libraries, many of them being closed, that's a concern, including for people who need the libraries to use the internet.
Okay.
Yeah, I think because of where we are with COVID, I mean, libraries in my communities are open and then closing when somebody tests positive for COVID. So it's all across the board, and I don't have a good template, but to the extent that you can work with your local library, that is a community hub that people tend to go to for things. And in past election, I would say I've staffed enough polling sites at libraries to know that they do that, but who knows what's happening in 2020.
And that's a good point. I hate to sound like a broken record.
Yeah.
Call your local election office. You can ask them where the precinct locations are. Another thing, and we didn't talk about this, but for homeless providers, you can also ask, it may be too late, but I'm not sure. You can ask if you can be a polling location. In Los Angeles, and I think even in the Bay Area, some LA Family Housing or Skid Row, there are certain organizations that are also polling locations. And that serves two things. You get registered to vote where you're at. You can vote where you're at. The clients don't have to go anywhere. So, figure out if you're able to do that, or if there is a provider who's already signed up for that and you can just bring your clients over, however the case may be. So we didn't talk about it either. Mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, that's another thing that you should just get familiar with, because some people may not want to, go out to vote, but, be familiar with that as well. Yep, election office. Yep, election, it's called a lot of different things in different states. So, but I think
you had one more question from Julie.
One more question. I think it was Kristen again.
I thought it was Julie.
Julie, well, I'll unmute Julie. Julie, you're unmuted.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to clarify what I was asking. Because the rules are so different in every state and even locally, what libraries tend to do, I'm a librarian, and what libraries tend to do is provide links to people. But of course, links are pretty useless. If the library is closed, and
Yeah.
Even if they're providing 24-hour internet access in their parking lot, you have to have a device, you have to have electricity. I mean, the digital divide has been really exacerbated by libraries being closed. So what I was thinking of doing is putting together a template that would tell the libraries what questions they should be answering, and then they could post it on their door, and they could also put it on their website. So I just didn't know if anyone ever had done anything like that, so that they could actually find out the local information for their own community rather than sending them to all of these websites where people have to like sort of wade through and click on this and fill in this and not have access. So that's what I had in mind. And maybe once I put it together, I could just send it to you, all of you, and you could take a look and see if it looked like I was missing something. And then I'm going to try to get it out to libraries right away. So that was my
That's a brilliant suggestion.
Send it to me. Yeah, you can send it to me and I'll forward it to them. I think that's exactly what all of us should be doing in some type of capacity. If we're on this call here and you're in the local area, that's the whole point about getting the information for your local area and spreading it like hotcakes. I was gonna say wildfires, but that's.
I was thinking about that too, and I thought maybe not in California.
No, so, definitely, Julie, thank you for that comment.
Yeah, and it's a brilliant, creative way to solve a problem that we're facing now. I really appreciate that. And it's something that you're attuned to the network of librarians so they can get the message out for their local jurisdiction.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's it, folks. Kristen, your hand is down. Did you have a question or are you good?
I will be respectful of everyone's time. I think I can follow up offline. Thank you all for a very informative session and the resources that you're helping connect people to and the conversation that we're having. But I'll carry my question offline so that everyone can close their day out.
I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer. This is being recorded. People can catch that if that helps, Kristen.
Sure. My question actually came out of some of the comments that were spoken throughout the session. I've been encountering a lot of pushback, particularly from folks who have lived experience with homelessness, that what they really feel like they're lacking is guidance on some of the things we've identified in the conversation as what we can actually talk about, which is what are the issues, who stands for what, and how should we vote without literally telling someone vote for this person or vote for that person, but really a qualitative understanding of what it is that they're being asked to vote for. They think voting is important, but in a generic sense. And they know that voting is meaningful, again, in the generic sense, but they don't know why they would go through all of the hoops, bells, and whistles when they're trying to just get through the day and find a place to stay safely at night for many of them, when there's no one that can provide them with the legwork that most of us do for ourselves because we have access to the internet and other resources, for example, to do our own research on candidates or issues. And I'm just curious if anyone else is experiencing that kind of response during their outreach, and if anyone who's on the panel has any insight on best strategies to respond to those kinds of issues.
So that's a great question. And I absolutely experienced that when I volunteered with Pathways DC. And this is how they approached it. So they were in the process of creating documents in one sheet so they can give to their clients those very things that you're talking about. A qualitative analysis for in DC for the DC City Council of officials that were running for seats on the board. So, you know, how they, what they're, and you can send questions to candidates as well. If they're local candidates, you can send questions to candidates, all of them. You want to be nonpartisan to see, you know, what are their stance on this. So they were creating an actual document that they can give to their clients when they were, say, if they again, if they weren't interested in in voting for whoever was going to become president, but they were they still, you know, you wanted to either talk to them about what was going on locally or that they care, but you didn't have that information. So you absolutely can create that information. That is going to take a little bit of time. Especially in your local area, because unless someone has done it in your local area, another neighboring organization, for instance, then you have to create that document and you have to give that information to your clients. But absolutely, that's what people are like, okay, well, besides the president or Democrat or Republican, what else am I voting on? You absolutely should let people know if there are measures on your ballot or things that are going to be, you know, harmful or are helpful to, you know, their lives or the plight of their situation, to encourage them to vote, and want to register to vote. So I think that you, to answer your question and to just sum it up really quickly, you absolutely should do it. That's what Pathways DC were doing. They designed something that's pretty fancy too, and I could send it to you if you want to see an example. And there should be examples. Nonprofit Vote should have examples in their engagement. I shared that link earlier, and I think Aaron did as well in the chat box. But they have examples of how to do that and things that you should consider when doing that, because again, you want to make sure that it's nonpartisan and that you're reaching out to everyone. But you absolutely should do it, and I think that that's going to help turn those people who are just over the divisiveness and probably the big election or the highest position, and bring some thought into caring about what's happening on a local perspective. And I think that's the reason why you will want to do that.
Yeah, and we also have resource and fact sheets on what David described as voter information guide. There is a way to do it in a nonpartisan way. I do cover in other trainings candidate form and questionnaires that you can do as well. So there may be other homelessness provider coalitions out there that have done something like this, but it's definitely something that is C3 permissible. And if it's too late for this election, definitely think about it for the next election, midterms, whatever it is. But it is, you know, I find that I still have to find information about it. So however much we can do to provide people who don't have a consistent connection to resources is going to be tremendously helpful, given all of the challenges that we have right now with lack of access to electricity or a computer or any of that kind of information. So if you can get your coalition together to do something quickly for the November election, that would be fabulous.
It would be great. It would be great. Absolutely. Okay, I'm just looking to see if we're missing anything. Everyone was just saying thank you. Are there any other questions? You can raise your hand if you're still here and you just have a burning question. I think we all agreed that we were going to stay on until you all are done listening to us talk. But I saw the comment that you guys are interested in us sharing. I'm going to try to share as much as we said that we're going to share today. But the good thing is I can always go back and look at what we promised to share and what's in the Q&A and the chat box function. Anything in the chat? I think you guys were handling that. Okay.
Do we have any other Q&A that we need?
No, I see there were 5. libraries, and then everyone would just they just reply thank you.
The person who did was doing something in Rhode Island or whatever, they didn't post it, so I could see it. Yeah, it defaults to all panelists, and you have to change it to the panelists and attendees. So they post a thing to the panelists.
Yeah, no, I think that's it, you guys.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Quinn and Michelle, once again. Couldn't have done it without you. You guys have a wealth of knowledge and just a great resource. I love how our organizations were able to work together for this, and I look forward to continuing this work together. If you guys want to say have any last remarks, please take the time to do so.
David, thank you for getting us together for this panel. It happened very quickly, and I don't think we could have done this without your leadership and guidance and vision of what you saw this panel to be, and it turned out a lot better than any one of us could have done on an individual effort. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely, thanks so much. And just check out I put the links to our guides in the chat, and please check it out and reach out with questions.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you guys have it. You have your homework. You know what to do. So let's get out and get people registered to vote. Thank you once again. You guys have a wonderful evening.